Die Gedanken sind frei,
my thoughts freely flower.
die Gedanken sind frei.
The purpose of Freethought Forum is to be vigilant to the encroachment of religion into government and to educate the general public as to what a freethinker is.
No person can deny, die Gedanken sind frei. No person can deny, die Gedanken sind frei.
I think as I please.
Hello, my name is Hugh Henry. This is Freethought Forum, and our subject today is the last books of the Bible, a question of truth. Previous talks in this series, we've discussed 12 books of the New Testament using Bart Ehrman's brief introduction to the New Testament. Tonight, we are doing the remaining 15 books. We have one gospel, 12 epistles or letters, 2 epistles that are not epistles at all. 3 of the epistles are around page length, so we will only mention them. That leaves 12 books, so let's get going. There is a question of truth. 4 of the epistles are known forgeries, 3 for Paul, 1 for Peter. 4 more are suspected forgeries, again, 3 for Paul, 1 for Peter. I'll explain how we know. 5 books are anonymous, but were later tagged with authors who did not write them. The Gospel of John, the 3 epistles of John attributed to John, and 1 epistle attributed to Paul. That leaves 2 books. These were written by men with the same name as disciples, but they were not the disciples. These books are the last books written to be included in the New Testament. They were written between 80 and 110 of the Common Era at the beginning of the 2nd century. This is 50 to 80 years after the crucifixion and 15 to 40 years after the death of the Apostle Paul. 1 more book was written in this period, Revelations, and was covered in an earlier talk. There are no disciples alive or anyone who heard Jesus preach. In Jerusalem, the temple was destroyed by the Romans years ago in 70 of the Common Era. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were crucified, and Jews are now forbidden to enter that city. Christians probably number in the hundreds of thousands, but no more, and are spread around the Mediterranean Sea. They now have bishops, ministers, and deacons. Christians are being persecuted and martyred by the Romans depending on the emperor and the provincial governor and their policies. Decades ago, Nero burned Rome and blamed the Christians. Jews are also active in opposition to Christians, and the feeling of dislike is quite mutual. The Gospel of John, Jesus the man sent from heaven. First, John didn't write it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't write those Gospels either. Before the mid-2nd century, their names weren't on them or associated with them in Christian writings. These names were added later to anonymous works, and, according to Acts, John of Zebedee, the supposed author, was uneducated and unable to read. Second, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels because you can lay them out next to each other and see many of the same stories and sayings across them. John isn't like that. There are many stories and sayings in the first Gospels that are not in John, and many found in John and found nowhere else. John doesn't even agree on the day of Jesus' death. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the solemn feast of Passover. On Passover day, Jews take lambs to the temple or buy them there. The lambs are sacrificed, then taken to the butcher, then taken home or to an inn for the Passover meal. For Christians, this is the Last Supper, to be followed by a night of praying, a night of rest, before dawn a trial, then crucifixion, and death. In John, there is a last meal, but it's not the Passover supper. It can't be. Jesus dies or is sacrificed on Passover day, the same time the lambs are being sacrificed. John is where the expression for Jesus, Lamb of God, comes from. Jesus is different too. He's less human. He's a divine being, the Word, equal in power to God, come to earth. His speeches focus on his divine origin, and his miracles are signs meant to prove. This is quite unlike Jesus in the other Gospels. In fact, in the other Gospels, when Jesus is asked to perform a miracle on demand by the Pharisees, or in the temptation by the devil, he rejects the demonstration or giving a sign as sinful, and that his words alone are better than Solomon or Jonah and should convince. Despite the difference, or perhaps because of it, the John Gospel was popular and beloved among early Christians and Christians since. It's here that Jesus makes extraordinary declarations about himself. He is the Word of God. He was before Abraham. He and the Father are one. We find here also the must-be-born-again text. Again, in other Gospels, Jesus hardly ever talks about himself. In John, he talks about nothing else. Finally, in this Gospel, the apocalypse, the coming judgment, the coming Messiah are almost gone, only 2 verses. In fact, in the raising of Lazarus, when Jesus assures Martha of Lazarus' resurrection, she agrees, thinking of the end of time. He corrects her. He means now. For those who believe in him, everlasting life, now. Just as with the other Gospels, this is written in the style of an ancient biography, in which the character of the subject is established at the beginning and never changes. But unlike the other Gospels, this one begins with a mystical meditation about a holy word, a being from eternity that was with God, yet was God. This word created the universe and provided light and life to all, entered the world he made, was rejected and received by a few. Only at the end of this meditation do we find out that the Word became a human being and his name was Jesus. Obvious to the reader, this is going to be the biography of a divine human being. It begins not with Jesus' birth, but with John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. The book divides into 2 halves, 3 years of ministry in which each statement by Jesus about who he is paired with a miracle suitable to it in 7 signs. 3 chapters then deal with the crucifixion, followed by 2 concerning Jesus' appearances after death. So, did whoever wrote this whip it up over a cup of wine? Not at all. By careful text analysis, we can see him splicing together perhaps 7 different earlier sources we no longer have but may, in some future, discover. There are 3 epistles in John in the New Testament. Just as with the Gospel, they were not written by John the disciple, nor by the author who did write that Gospel. They were written by the same person, someone from the same congregation as the author of the Gospel John, and at a much later date. The first epistle is not a letter written to someone, but is a persuasive essay or an open letter. All these epistles are on the same subject. There has been a split in the community. Dissidents have taken the man sent from heaven theme of the gospel much further. According to the author, they now claim that Jesus was not a man, was wholly divine, was God himself. According to the authors, these epistles is wrong, and according to later Orthodox Christianity, this is heresy. In an earlier presentation, I discussed the 7 epistles known to be written by the Apostle Paul. Now it's time to discuss the 7 epistles attributed to Paul, but not written by him. I'll first talk about 3 probable forgeries, and then 3 known forgeries. Paul was the most forged Christian writer. There are Gospels, epistles, revelations, apocryphons, Acts, and more. There's a whole fictional correspondence dialogues with the Roman philosopher Seneca, and whole long acts of Paul and Thecla, an early Christian woman saint who had many churches dedicated to her until her forger was caught. The documents of his trial are available today. But how can I make these claims of forgeries in the Bible? How do I know? Forgery was widespread in the ancient world. In one case, the physician Galen found a book for sale in a shop, a book he never wrote. So Galen wrote a book on how to tell his real work from forgeries. One obvious way to tell are anachronisms, things out of time. If you found a letter from Paul that said, go to Mass Saturday night, go to confession 3 times a week, and say 3 Hail Marys for each sin, what would you think? Some of these forged documents deal with a church with bishops and deacons, something that happens long after Paul. Some contradict something central to Paul's known teaching. A more subtle argument has to do with the style that Paul wrote in, succinct. Literary Greek went for long, involved, complex sentences and very flowery. That's not Paul. We should not think of the forgers as criminals with criminal intent. With Christian forgeries, there's the best intent. But the author has an urgent message that must be heard and believed, and coming from Chuck, the barber of Athens, it won't be. Coming from the Apostle Paul, it'll be believed and followed. Let's begin with 3 epistles or letters that are controversial. The second epistle to the Thessalonians looks like Paul's styles, but there's a problem with content. There's a contradiction. The epistle indicates that there's time until the judgment, and there'll be certain signs that will be the tip-off. That's not what Paul wrote in the first epistle to the Thessalonians. He warned them the end would come with no advanced warning, like a thief in the night, bringing sudden destruction. Paul's writing always emphasizes this. Paul never knew when he wrote a letter whether it would arrive before the judgment and the end of the world. The end of the epistle says, "I write this with my own hand," not dictated. "This is the mark on every letter I write," and signs it. But that's not true for most of Paul's epistles. Not even 1 Thessalonians is signed. Finally, the opening warns that people are forging epistles in Paul's name and to accept only the genuine article. If Paul did write this, Paul is saying there are forgeries in his name, beware. If he did not write it, then a forger is saying it. Either way, we have epistles forged in Paul's name. The epistle to the Colossians is written to a church that Paul did not found, but here supposedly heard about. He's glad that Christianity has arrived, but they suffer from false prophets. Just like Paul always did, the writer tells them that they do not have to be circumcised and they don't have to keep kosher. The letter goes further. Through baptism into Christianity, you have been raised and resurrected with Christ. That's too far. Paul had problems with congregations that got a bit wild and strange, thinking they were already resurrected. Paul hammers them for this attitude in his other letters. They are not incorruptible saints, just good candidates. Paul didn't write this letter. The style in the original Greek is also complex and flowery. That's not Paul either. Finally, Colossae itself was destroyed around 61 of the Common Era. So if this letter was written as a forgery between 80 and 110, the forger was not actually writing a letter to Colossae in Paul's name. He just wanted to write a letter that would be believed by Christians as Paul's letter. It's in the New Testament, so it worked. We don't know who the epistle to the Ephesians was addressed to. What? Modern translations say, to the Ephesians, but early copies don't have that. We think it was a circular letter set around the churches, and during copying, a scribe in Ephesus personalized it. The letter addresses how Jews and Gentiles are now one through Christ and equal and can live in harmony. The second half has exhortations on how to live, roles as husbands, wives, children, and fathers. So what's wrong? Style again. The opening thanksgiving is 12 verses long and 1 sentence. There are lots of long sentences in this epistle. That's not at all Paul's style. Again, believers are said to be resurrected already. That's not Paul. There's a different concept of works. In Paul, they refer to Jews keeping the Jewish laws. In this epistle, there's no reference to Jews, and works refers to good deeds. Now let's look at 3 epistles that are forgeries, according to most scholars. They're called the pastoral epistles, not because they refer to the countryside, but because they're addressed to persons, pastors, that Paul appointed to lead his churches. Most scholars believe that these 3 epistles were written by the same author, but not Paul. Instead of individually, I'm going to discuss all 3 epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, together. The problems addressed are false teachers and internal organization. The false teachers appear to be Gnostics. I discussed them in an earlier program, but will summarize them now. Gnostic Christians believed that there were 12 gods or 365 gods in a long string of begats. So God 1 makes God 2, who makes God 3. Near the end, the god Sophia, or wisdom, makes a mistake and creates a stupid creator god who makes the material world we live in, which is a mistake. Souls exist way up at the top of this chain, worshiping the great God, but they get distracted by the material world far below and fall into human beings. Gnosis is the true knowledge of who we really are. Gnosis is Greek for knowledge. In these epistles, the false teachers chatter about what is falsely called knowledge. They are enthralled with myths and endless genealogies. They forbid marriage and demand demand abstinence from foods. Later Gnostics were ascetics and abused their bodies. This certainly looks like Gnostics he's talking about. The problem is, the earliest Gnostics lived in the early to mid-2nd century, long after Paul had died. There's a problem with the vocabulary of the epistles. Fully a full third of the words they use are words not used by Paul in his epistles, but were used by Christians in the mid-2nd century. Finally, the organization of the church involves bishops, deacons, and presbyters. Paul was founding the first congregations of Christianity. The church would not have this organization for decades. This is Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum, talking about the last books of the Bible. Before I discuss the Epistle to the Hebrews, I need to discuss the relationship between the new religion, Christianity, and the religion it came from, Judaism, at the beginning of the 2nd century. It's tricky. Jesus and his disciples are Jews. The authors of the New Testament understood that Christianity sprang from Judaism, but tensions mount as missionaries convert so many pagans to Christianity, and these pagans become the new Christians and Christian leaders, and these new Christians claim they can benefit from the promises given by God to Israel without even following Jewish laws, customs, or practices. Finally, all peoples of the Roman world had to worship the gods of Rome, except Jews, who were granted an exemption because of an ancient tradition. Christians, mostly newly converted Roman pagans, were not exempted this way because this was a new religion. Failure to properly worship the Roman and local gods generally made these gods very angry. So whenever fire, flood, earthquake, or famine struck, Christians got blamed. But Christians claimed they were a continuation of the ancient Hebrew tradition, that Jews themselves had rejected their prophesied Messiah and turned away. But if Christians were somehow the new Hebrews, how were they different? How were Christians to be defined? The Epistle to the Hebrews was not by Paul, nor an epistle, nor to the Hebrews. It's the earliest sermon outside the gospel. It appears someone copied the sermon to send it as a letter and tacked on a letter's ending. The book is anonymous, but was eventually admitted to the New Testament by Christians who thought Paul had written it. It had a hard time getting in. The problem addressed is this. These Christians are converted pagans. They're enduring intense persecution as Christians, but Jews in the neighborhood are not. Someone gets a great idea. Since Christians and Jews worship the same God, why not convert to Judaism and avoid the hassle? The preacher's answer is no, 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 no. Just no. This book, Hebrews, has all the answers why this is a really bad idea. First, over and over again, the author stresses that Christ and faith in him are superior to anything in Judaism. He is superior to the prophets. God is now speaking through his own Son. He is superior to the angels. Again, angels are God's messenger, but this is God's Son. He is superior to Moses. Moses was a servant in God's house, but Jesus is the son of that house. In the Old Testament, God promised a new covenant, showing the old Jewish covenant was outmoded and imperfect. Jesus is the minister of the new covenant, etc. Second, the author maintains that the Old Testament and its religion are a mere shadow, a foreshadowing of what comes with Christ. Both the Old Testament and the tabernacle were just shadows of another reality. Scholars have long recognized that the author is bringing the popular philosophy of the Greek pagan Plato into Christianity. Plato insisted that things appearing to be real are often only shadows of a greater reality. Plato has the famous allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners who live all their lives chained in a cave, their head held in place. Behind them, unknown to them, is a low half-wall, behind that a large fire. Between the half-wall and the fire, people are carrying puppets in the shapes of plants, animals, and humans. The prisoners themselves can see only the shadows on the wall of things going on behind them, and when they hear the puppets echoing off the wall, they naturally assume it's the images themselves who are speaking. They think the shadows are reality. If one of them were freed, he would at first be blinded. In his terror, he might beg to be chained again. But if his eyes grew accustomed to the light, he would realize how he had been deceived. For the author of Hebrews, Jesus is the reality that was foreshadowed in the Jewish scriptures, and for his readers, there is no turning back to the shadows. At this point, I'd like to discuss something I call Lego Christianity. Legos are little interchangeable parts that are designed to be put together into anything you can imagine. Christians who take a verse from here and one from there and interpret both from one from somewhere else are not doing Bible study, they're doing Lego Christianity. You can see where these epistles we've been talking about are letters to. They were never meant to address belief through the ages. The sermon of Hebrews addresses a specific problem with specific people that occurred in the 2nd century. Christians converting to Judaism is not a major problem today. But phrases from this text could be used to fuel hatred of the Jews and to justify that there is no salvation outside the church. Using Lego Christianity, Jesus supported slavery, Jesus was a Marxist revolutionary. God wants women subservient, Jesus was a feminist. God wants appointed kings, God wants democracy. Anything they can imagine can be supported with Lego Christianity. There's no restriction on what can be true. The Bible will never contradict them because it's never given a chance. If a given preacher or a given church doesn't agree completely with what they want, just go find one that does. Then the next great project is to rifle through Revelations, Isaiah, and Samuel and use your phrases to show that the end of the world is soon coming. These books were written by various individuals who lived in context, addressed specific problems, and had an agenda. They were meant to be read whole and with that understanding. To shuffle words from all the Gospels together, as Christians do at Easter with the last words of Christ, is to create a soup sandwich, an incoherent mess. There are 2 epistles of Peter. The problem is, according to the Bible, Peter was an illiterate fisherman who only knew Aramaic and did not know Greek. Some scholars think that the first epistle may have been as told to, the way some modern biographies are written. Peter told a Greek scribe what he wanted to say, then the scribe wrote the letter in literate Greek. Many scholars think it was forged in Peter's name. It's addressed to Christian exiles suffering persecution and is about enduring that suffering. In fact, the word suffering appears more times in this short letter than in any other book in the New Testament, including whole Gospels. He urges them to be obedient slaves, submissive wives, tender husbands, to obey all governing authority, and to be devoted subjects to the emperor. These are all guidelines for avoiding persecution and put shame on those who wrongfully cause abuse. He reminds them that they now have a privileged status with God. They are specially chosen by God, and God will soon end the world and bring the believers' suffering to the end. There is more agreement among scholars that the 2nd epistle of Peter is a forgery than any other New Testament book. There is at least one forgery in the New Testament. It is this one. The book isn't even mentioned before 220 of the Common Era. The style of writing is completely different from 1 Peter. Even ancient Christians thought this was a forgery. 2 Peter had a terrible time getting into the Bible. Revelations had an awful trouble too. The problem with the Revelations of John was the style. Horrible, misspelled, ungrammatical Greek, which was completely unlike the Gospel of John or his epistles. They were right. John didn't write that Gospel, nor the epistles. Someone named John wrote Revelations. Neither was the disciple John. What happened was a deal was made between the partisans of Revelations and the partisans of 2 Peter. They supported each other and both books made it in. How do we know? We have correspondence from the time. I'll add that after Paul, Peter was the most forged apostle. Forgeries include Acts of Peter, Apocalypse of Peter, Gospel of Peter. They didn't make it in. This one did. The author is preaching against cleverly devised myths about Jesus that appear to be from the Gnostics again. These Gnostic Christians were a special problem because they existed underground as members within congregations, claiming to be a secret elite with special knowledge. The epistle of James was written by somebody named James, but not James, the brother of Jesus. The subject is ethics and ethical behavior. It appears to directly contradict Paul on being saved or justified by deeds. Paul says, a person is justified by faith apart from works prescribed by the law. James says a person is justified by works, not by faith alone. Or perhaps not. Paul, speaking of works, means acts of obedience to the Jewish law. James means good deeds. Faith without works is dead. The ethics is somewhat Christian from Jesus' sermons and somewhat not, perhaps Jewish. Some scholars think that James is a book of Jewish wisdom with a thin Christian gloss. The short epistle of Jude was written by someone named Jude and included because he was supposed to be the disciple Jude, but he wasn't. It is a defense. It is against false prophets, probably Gnostics again, and it's quoted in 2 Peter. In a court of law, witnesses are asked to place their hand upon the Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Yet of the 27 books of the New Testament, 4 are known forgeries, 4 are suspected forgeries, 8 were written anonymously and later given names of apostles or companions of apostles, 4 were accepted because the author's name was like that of an apostle, but we know that's not who wrote it. 7 were actually written by the apostle Paul. The Old Testament has similar problems. The book of Samuel was written in 200 before the Common Era, forged in the name of a prophet who lived in 600 before the Common Era. In a court of law, after sworn testimony, the jury decides who is telling the truth. What I have told you is the verdict of the great majority of biblical scholars after decades of study. This is the current truth of the scholars. However, in news recently, a Bedouin Arab has sold 2 fragments of text believed to have come from a cave on the southern Jordan River. A goat may have stepped through a hole with clay jars and ancient manuscripts. This has been Hugh Henry for Freethought Forum. This is an uncertain world, but I'm fairly certain we'll be back again. Please tune in, and thank you.
I think as I please, and this gives me pleasure.
My conscience decrees, this right I must treasure.
My thoughts will not cater
To duke or dictator, no person